If you're building a growth company, a company that plans to sell a product or a service nationally or internationally, then someday odds are good that you'll be presenting your business opportunity to an investor to raise the funding you need to grow your company. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about the investor pitch. We'll talk about, first of all, what's the goal of the investor pitch anyway? It might surprise you what the immediate goal is. And then talk about some technique to keep in mind while you're doing your presentation. We'll talk about some preparation that you should go through before the presentation. And then we'll get into the actual investor deck. Now, we won't go through a complete startup pitch template, but we'll go through a pretty complete checklist of what investors expect to be covered in an investor presentation. We'll talk about some things that you should be doing before, during, and after a presentation to an investor or investor group, and then a little bit about the timing. How much time should you spend on each topic in your investor pitch? And then finally, we'll talk about a pitch checklist that will cover everything we'll talk about today that'll help you assess the effectiveness of your own investor presentation. Now, before we start, one caveat: every audience is different. Every investor is different. They have different experiences, different expectations, and different investors will give you different advice on how to do an effective presentation. And you know, that's life as an entrepreneur. You'll get conflicting feedback and suggestions from everybody. You have to decide which techniques work best for you. What I can tell you that is what I'll talk about today is based on my experience doing a lot of pitches as an entrepreneur and certainly hearing a lot of pitches as an investor. I have a pretty good idea of certainly what works for me and what I've seen work for a lot of other investors. So what is the goal of an investor presentation? Now, of course, it's part of the long-term process of raising money, but it's not too likely that you're going to get a check at the end of the presentation. Sorry, but it usually takes longer than that. No, I would argue that the more immediate goal of an investor presentation is to get a second meeting. To get a second meeting where you can spend more time answering questions, addressing concerns, building the relationship, and eventually getting to a check, to an investment. Now, the question is, how do you do that? How do you get to the second meeting? And that brings us to what I would argue are the real focused short-term goals of doing an investor presentation. Goal number one, you'd like to be understood. Clearly, if the audience doesn't understand your business model or the value, you're lost before you start. You would be surprised how often that happens, how often an entrepreneur will do a presentation and investors walk away saying, you know, I still don't really understand what that business is all about. We'll talk about some of the reasons that happens and some of the ways that you can make sure it doesn't happen to you. They have to be interested in what you're talking about. If you're not generating some interest, they won't be very motivated to learn more about your business. But more than being interesting, they have to see that it's compelling. Compelling in at least a couple of ways. Number one, compelling from the customer's point of view. That you're talking about something that's so compelling that the customer really will be motivated to buy what you're selling. But number two, compelling from an investment opportunity point of view, which means it's a large enough potential opportunity to be worth the risk of an investor investing in your business. It has to be memorable. Investors see a lot of presentations, and honestly, after a while, you have to work a lot to not confuse them. You want your presentation to be memorable so that you stand out from the pack. And you want it to be motivating. At the end of the day, this is a motivational pitch. You're trying to motivate somebody to actually take that second meeting. Those are the real immediate goals that you want to accomplish in your investor presentation. Next, we'll talk about what you can do to try to accomplish more of those goals. Suggestion number one, tell a story. People are wired to understand and appreciate and really get involved in stories. For more than 100,000 years, people have learned through storytelling. That's been around a lot longer than the written language. That's really a pretty new innovation. For a long, long time, it's been storytelling that we have learned through. I think it's almost a Darwinian thing. The people that survived were the people who were able to absorb information through stories. So we really are hardwired for that. If you want the audience to really understand what the customer need is, why it's compelling, and why your solution is a good fit, tell a story, and they'll most likely understand what you're talking about. Number 2, show some proof. Don't leave it purely on faith for the audience to believe that what you're talking about is real. You say customers like this idea and it is a compelling need. Have you talked to 30 or 40 or 50 customers who told you that? Well, that's pretty strong data. If you have, you can share that. Do you have some orders already from customers? Or better yet, do you have some revenue? Have some people actually paid you for your solution? Those are all compelling evidence that what you're talking about really is a need that people have and is compelling. Go slow. If you try to cram so much into your presentation that you have to rush through, you're going to lose people and confuse them. And that happens a lot. Entrepreneurs are so immersed in their startup idea. They know so much. They think about it so much. They want to convey as much as they possibly can during a presentation. And that's always a bad idea, because the more you try to convey, the more detail you throw in, the more you share of all this rich knowledge that you have, the more you're going to confuse people because they don't have the big picture. What you need to do is back off, go slow, don't rush, and explain what is the unmet need? What is your solution? Why are you convinced that it really is compelling to customers? How do you compare to the competition? And so forth. If you go slow, people will understand what you're talking about. Related to going slow is keep it simple. If you use complex language, jargon, acronym, you're going to lose people. You'll force them to pause and think about what you just said. What did that mean? And then they're losing the next sentence, and then they're losing more and more, and before long they've missed out on a goodly part of the story. So keep things simple, and people will be able to follow you more easily. And when I say simple, my suggestion is always use words and concepts that a middle school student would understand. We're not talking college, we're talking middle school. If you do that, then people won't have to stop and think about what the heck did that word or concept or acronym mean. They'll be able to absorb much more quickly what you meant, and they won't get lost. They'll be able to keep following your story, and that's what you want them to do. Be credible. If you say something that just seems totally over the top, well, your audience is going to pretty much tune out. So if you say something pretty aggressive, be sure you back it up right away with some justification that really backs up that, yeah, this really is true. It really is credible. The last thing you want to do in a presentation is lose your credibility. Be concrete. Stay away from abstract words like disruptive, out of the box, revolutionary. Those don't tell me anything about what the problem is and what your solution is. They're just filler words. So use concrete words that are easy to understand. Talk very concretely about what the problem is and how you solve that problem. People will be much more likely to understand your story. Of course, your story has to be compelling. Remember, that was one of the goals. Well, how are you going to be compelling? Well, first of all, by doing everything that we just talked about, but also by showing some passion. If you're not passionate about your business idea, you certainly won't generate any passion in the investor group. You have to show some excitement. You have to show that you are committed to making this opportunity happen because it's a big, exciting opportunity. That's what investors need to read from your presentation. So show some passion. Be relevant. You need to cover the topics in your investor pitch that investors want to understand about your business. And it's not just all about your product, it's about your business as an investment opportunity. In a minute, we'll go through a list of exactly what those topics are, so stay tuned. A little bit about technique. First of all, You need a strong start. Hook the audience right up front. I would not start by saying how great the weather is today. Thanks for having me here today. Jump right in. Maybe a strong start is jumping right into your customer story that immediately gets people hooked on how compelling your idea is. Maybe you start with what a large opportunity this is dollar-wise. There are different ways to start with a strong start, but just make sure that your start is strong enough that you're going to hook investor attention. When you're doing any presentation, make sure you're using an open, expansive posture. You don't want to be hunched over. Don't put your hands in your pocket. Don't sort of stare at the floor while you're presenting. You want to be open, an open, strong posture. That conveys confidence. It conveys passion and energy. It just comes across more positively. So make sure you're using an open posture when you're practicing your presentation. Be sure to use what I call the strategic pause in your presentation. A pause is actually a very powerful tool. If you pause after making an important statement, you're giving the audience time to absorb that, to think about it and understand what you just said. It really increases people's ability to absorb what you're talking about. So be sure that you pace yourself. Be sure that you don't cram so much into your presentation that you don't have time to use a strategic pause now and then. Look at the audience. If you're presenting to some slides behind you, you don't want to be turning around all the time, looking at the slides, and God forbid, reading the slides faced away from the audience. No, look at the audience. Maintain eye contact. If you're not looking at them, odds are, first of all, they won't hear you, and odds are the presentation certainly will not come off that strongly. If you're using PowerPoint, use the presentation mode. Now, hopefully you'll have a laptop or some display in front of you so you can easily glance down and see that and only very momentarily take your eyes off the audience, as opposed to having to look in back of you. Now, the presentation mode tells you what's coming up on the next slide or the next build of your current slide so that you get reminded of what you're about to talk about. If that's in front of you, it helps you keep your eyes on the audience. A couple of thoughts on preparation for your presentation. First of all, practice. I think practice is the single most important thing you can do in preparing for a presentation. Do not keep modifying your slides up to the very last minute so when you go out to present, it's a deck that you really haven't practiced thoroughly. That's almost always a mistake. No, give yourself some time. Finish off the deck well before your presentation date and spend a lot of time practicing. It will increase your confidence. You'll understand what the transitions are. In general, your presentation will just come off so much more smoothly if you practice it a lot before you do the actual presentation. Record yourself. Doing a video recording can be a great way to learn more and to improve on your presentation. People do the funniest things when they're presenting up on a stage without realizing it. So record yourself and try to make it realistic. Imagine that you really are in front of an audience and go through your presentation like it was the real thing. And actually, if you can, have somebody record you in the real thing, the real presentation, because again, you'll learn a lot. Really often people do things like, sway back and forth or sort of walk forward and backward. Again, all kinds of things that you might not even be aware that you're doing. So do a recording of yourself and see what you can learn about how you can improve your presentation technique. Test your pitch with an audience that doesn't know anything about your business. That way, you can, at the end, ask them, did you understand what I said? Were there some terms I use that you didn't know what they meant? Can you explain back to me now what my business is? If they really understood it, they should be able to do that. You'll learn a lot from that because if you're using, again, a complex story, a complex language, whatever, that's just not really conveying, or if it's not simply not coming across with much passion, that's the kind of feedback you can get from a test audience. Now, don't do this with your team members. Your team members already understand what the business is. They're not going to give you feedback, honestly, that's that useful. No, do it with an audience that hasn't heard about your business yet. You'll get much more useful feedback. And frankly, it's a lot better to get feedback from them about what they don't understand than to do the pitch in front of investors and then find out that nobody knows what you're talking about. And then practice even more. You can never practice too much for your presentation. Keep on practicing. So let's talk about the investor pitch deck. The most important thing about the investor pitch deck, of course, is that you have to be relevant. You need to understand what it is that an investor is interested in and make sure that you cover those topics in your presentation. So, what are those things? Well, let's go through the list. First of all, there's the unmet need. What is the unmet need and who is the customer? Who is the underserved audience out there that you're focusing on? And what is the solution that you're going to provide to them, which you believe provides a better solution than what's out there? In particular, better than what the competition is offering. So you want to talk about who the competition is, and you want to talk about what your advantage is that you believe will make customers want your product over the competition product, at least the customers that you're focusing on. Might not be the perfect answer for everybody, but why will your target customers prefer your solution over the competition? What is your business model? How will you make money? And what's your market? How big is it? What are the segments in your market? What are the trends going on in your market? What is your go-to-market strategy? How will you manufacture your product? How will you sell it? How will you let people know about it? In other words, how will you market? How will you create awareness and leads for your product? What's your 5-year revenue forecast, and when will you hit cash flow break even? What funding have you received to date from, say, the founding team, maybe from other investors, grants? And what have you accomplished to date with that funding? Talk a little bit about your team. What are the strengths of the team? If you have some obvious holes in the team, it's not a bad idea to talk about that too, and to talk about what you're doing to fill those holes. What's your investor exit strategy? In other words, if an investor does invest in your company, how will that investor get paid back? More often than not, they'll get paid back when another bigger company acquires your company. Great. So to make this credible, talk about what companies you think are likely to buy your company. Why would they buy your company? When do you expect that to happen, and why that timing? And how much would you expect them to buy your company for? And again, what evidence do you have for that valuation? Those are the kinds of things that go into a credible investor exit strategy. What are you asking for in terms of funding, and what exactly will you accomplish with that funding over what period of time? And then finally, it's always good to end with a trial close. Now, a trial close is really simply asking for the next step. It's not asking for the money, but it's asking for the next step to the money. One trial close would be to ask, what more would you need to know to feel comfortable investing in our business? It's not asking for the money, but it's asking for the next step to get to the money. One other comment about your pitch deck. Please keep your slides simple. If you make your slides complicated with a lot of small font size words or a very complex graph or chart, you're forcing the audience to make an unfortunate choice. I have to decide, am I going to focus my attention on understanding your complex slide, or am I going to listen to you? Because frankly, the human brain does not do two things at once. You do one or you do the other. Well, I'd rather have an audience listen to me when I'm doing a presentation instead of having them focus on my complicated slide. So I always try to keep slides very simple, something that an investor can take in literally 3 or 4 seconds, so that primarily they're listening to me They're not spending a lot of time understanding this complex slide. So I suggest you follow the same rule. Keep those slides simple so the focus is on you. Now, a few things to do before a pitch. One, of course, is to arrive early so that you can at least start to get prepared for the unexpected, because unfortunately, unexpected problems will happen. Maybe the projector doesn't work. Maybe your thumb drive doesn't convey the presentation to their computer. Maybe you brought a keynote presentation and they only can handle PowerPoint. Maybe somebody shows up late. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong. So show up early, put together contingency plans, be ready to do your presentation without any technology at all if you have to. Because again, problems unfortunately happen a lot. A couple things to think about during your pitch. One suggestion I always make is to have at least one other team member in the room with you for a number of reasons. First of all, they can help with questions. If you're doing the presentation, your adrenaline's pumping, you're up there in front of the audience, and you get a question, it can happen. Sometimes your mind goes blank and you don't have a clue what to say. Having a second team member there can really help. They can say, hey, I can field that question, and give you a break to sort of recover and get ready for the next question. So that's one important thing a team member can do. Another thing is just to take notes. You're up doing the presentation. You don't want to be stuck with taking notes. You want to be focused on the audience and interacting with the audience. So have a team member there who can take notes about important comments, things that you want to check out later, things that you've committed to do for follow-up and so forth. The other thing your team member can do is watch body language. Now, you're up in front of the audience and you're clearly watching them, but come on, your adrenaline's pumping, you're thinking about a response to a question. Your team member can sit there and look around the audience and watch for body language. You can learn a lot from how people react to what's being said and the way questions are answered. So make sure that somebody is watching the audience. Of course, collecting business cards. Somebody needs to have that on their checklist. That's a great job for another team member to do who's there with you. And then finally, the trial close. The team member should make sure that you're the one on the spot. You don't have a checklist up there. They can have a checklist and make sure, trial close. Did we do a trial close before we get out the door? So a lot of value add that a second team member can have. And aside from everything else we've talked about, one other thing to keep in mind during the pitch. You will most likely get advice and different kinds of comments from investors. And you may actually disagree with some of that advice. It may be advice on something that you thought about before, you looked into, and for various reasons decided not to do. Well, the last thing you want to do in a presentation is to act defensive or get into a debate with investors. So it's usually a better strategy to graciously accept advice. If it is something that you thought about before carefully and for various reasons rejected it, you can say that. But you might also say, appreciate the input and maybe we should go back and reconsider that. There's no harm in that. But again, don't get defensive and don't get into a debate with investors. That's probably not going to help. Couple things to do after the pitch. Of course, one thing you want to do is debrief with your team, hopefully with that team member or other team members who were there to observe and hear what happened. What adjustments might you need to make? What in general did you learn? And what was the follow-up that you needed to do? What thank you emails do you need to send? And what actions did you commit to? So be sure you get together and debrief after a presentation and do the appropriate follow-up. A word about timing. Now, I went through a total of 14 topics that I suggest go into your pitch. Let's say you're doing a 10-minute pitch. You've got 14 topics. Well, if you do the math, that's 43 seconds per topic on average. Now, are you going to spend exactly 43 seconds on each topic? Of course not. There are some things you'll spend less time on, some things more time on. But in general, it's a good idea to keep in mind. If you're doing a 10-minute pitch, thinking about 43 seconds as a target for each of those topics is a good idea, including talking about your product, right? Your solution to the problem. You don't want that to be half of the presentation. That leaves way too little time to talk about the other 13 topics. So, of course, you'll spend more time on some things, including maybe your solution, and less time on some others. But make sure you allocate enough time to cover each of the topics, because in 43 seconds on average, you can definitely cover all the topics. What if it's a 1-minute pitch? Okay, that's 4.3 seconds per topic. That's not enough. Clearly, if you're doing the 1-minute pitch, you're not going to cover everything, but that's okay. Covering everything was never the goal. Remember, the goal was to get a second meeting. So if it's a 1-minute pitch, you just have to pare down. What's the most important story you can tell an investor to generate enough interest that they want to know more? So again, 10 minutes, 1 minute, whatever the time is, be sure you think about the time and make sure that you consciously decide to allocate enough time to cover the topics that you want to cover. Last but not least, if you'd like to get a pitch checklist that covers everything we've talked about today so that you have your own tool for assessing your own presentation, there's a link in the show notes below where you can get exactly such a checklist. And that completes our presentation on how to pitch investors effectively. Thank you very much for watching. If this was helpful, please click the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, please do that. And if you have any questions or comments on what I've covered today, please leave a comment in the comments down below. With that, thanks for listening. And again, please subscribe and check out our next video.